All right, well then officially welcome to our Homegarden Variety Trial 2022 end of year recap. And we're going to share just a little bit of a summary of the data that you all have graciously and kindly sent in. It's been a really fun year. And then, that will definitely not take the whole time, and we'll have time at the end to hear your thoughts and more of your experiences this year. Maybe once you see some of the data, it'll jog your memory and think about some things that you might want to share. And then we'll talk about some of what we're thinking about for next year. So we're just glad to have y'all. And I am actually going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sykes, who you don't get to hear from as much, but she does the hard work in the background. She spent the last week crunching all the data and running the statistics. So Virginia, take it away.
All right, so we're going to start off with participation then. Over the past several years since we started this in 2017, I mean, the trial has grown tremendously. We had a bit of a dip there in 2020 when we had COVID and nobody knew what was going on, but you can see that this year we have around 1,100 trials that went out. So this is the most that we have ever put out, just tremendous participation. 189 trialers representing 56 counties. And right there at the bottom, you can see all of the counties that are represented there on the map for, and is this 2022 or is that 2023, Natalie?
That's 2022's map. So we kind of see what last year's looked like. We
don't have our map yet for
Yeah.
2023, but you can see 2022. We have really great representation across the state. So really we're getting data that I feel like meets needs across the state, because we can really look at all of these very different environments across the state of Tennessee. So we couldn't do it without you guys. So thank you so much for participating this year. It's our best year ever. All right. And so where can you find this information? Our variety trial report is on UT Hort. And so that's where you can find all of the information about the variety trials. I think, is that also where you can register for next year, Natalie? And Natalie put that link in the chat.
Yeah, right now we don't have the registration page up for next year, but of course I've got everybody's email addresses, so when we get that going, we'll send it out.
Right, so it'll eventually be up here. We're still working on doing pairs and things, which is part of the reason for this meeting, is to talk about some of the things that you all want to trial next year. So as soon as that goes out, Natalie will send out an email with an update, and she is going to talk to you about our results. But I'll talk real quickly about kind of the data part and how we analyze this. So we take all of the data that you put in, and we're able to test that statistically to see whether one of these was better in terms of any of these characteristics that you rated it on. So some of these you'll see, like that germination, you can see it's kind of half and half. So half of the people thought one variety did better, half of the people thought the other, or they thought that they did the same. Sometimes you'll see it where it looks like it should be different, like yield. You can see 3/4 of the people said one variety was better than the other, but when we don't have enough trialers for that trial, sometimes that won't give us a statistical difference. But obviously you can take that data and look at it and say, well, I think that Antigua had better yield based on this, and you can make your own decision. But statistically, the ones that did better, you can see there, are in green. So for plant health, that Antigua did much better than the, I don't know how to pronounce the other one, Dulcina. And then our overall rating. So that's what you all rated on a scale of 1 to 10, what you thought that variety was. And then we also have, or maybe we don't have this in here. We had, oh, wait, sorry, let's go back. Okay, up there at the top, the reason you recommended, and I think that's really useful information too, because if you're looking for something, like if you had a lot of bugs this year and you're like, well, man, I really want something that's very healthy, it's going to have better disease resistance, better insect tolerance, then you can look up there and it'll tell you whether people rated that specifically higher for that reason. Or as you can see here, that Antigua, it had more people rated it highly for flavor. And so that's a way we can interpret some of those results there. And then, of course, Natalie, she writes a little summary of some of the comments that you all sent in. And we always have some very interesting comments there. And then a picture of that variety, or one of those varieties. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Natalie?
Virginia made fun of me for wearing gloves. She said it looked weird. I was like, those are
I do think the gloves,
my food safety in the field practices. I think there's some barehanded posing for shots coming up
Yeah.
It'll make you feel better.
And then this is always at the very end of that publication. And this is a summary of all of the years that we have done evaluations. So anything that ranked higher than a 70% across any of the years that we evaluated will be listed here. So this is a really great place to look for a sort of a summary sheet of what varieties are recommended in Tennessee based on our trial results. And so you can go through there and you can see the year that it rated 70% or higher, how many people recommended it, what that rating was, and reasons that they loved it. So that's a really great resource to kind of consolidate our results over the past five years now. 17, six years.
Yeah, like 6 or 7. Yeah.
Time flies. All right. So we also in our data collection asked you where you grew things. 43% were in the garden, 43% were in raised beds. So very much split there. And then 14% of people doing these in containers. And we had some container options this past year, but most of ours are meant for raised beds or in the garden. And then how you fertilize. And this is, we did a paper a few years ago looking at how some of those fertility ratings related to the results that we saw in the trials and whether we had product failure. But we have 30% of people using conventional fertilizer, 25% using compost alone, and then 25% using compost plus an organic fertilizer. And then 20% of people are not fertilizing at all. And Natalie, did you want to comment at all on that?
Well, probably the most useful thing that I could say about the none is that a lot of times what we'll see when we dig into the data is that goes with poor germination. So oftentimes that was a crop that didn't, really come up and grow very well. And so that was a question that we had a few years ago. We were like, well, this is interesting. What's a cause and what's effect? And I think it's probably more effect than it is cause.
Yeah, I'd say so. We also asked people whether their trial succeeded or not. So sometimes we get to the end and we don't have data for something, but we don't have a reason as to why we don't have data. And so this is really an important question for us in helping to understand what happened to that trial. So did you just not return data because you got frustrated with our survey, or is it because there was a trial failure? And so this is really important for us to understand kind of where we can improve on the trialing program and where we could help people in future years, like at what time point do we start to see that failure so that we can provide some solutions maybe for it. So for most of the people who trialed, we didn't have any issues with that trial throughout the year. 9% saw issues with their site. 8% saw issues with insects or diseases, which I'm kind of surprised given your comments a little earlier about people seem to have a little buggy season. I'm surprised that's not a little higher. 8% germination, 7% wildlife issues, so very much split. 3%, they had no idea why it failed, it just failed. And then 0.5% from human error. I always enjoy reading the comments about the wildlife issues, though. Those are always my favorite. Like the raccoons got it, so I couldn't taste it. They just amuse me. But I'm easily amused by things.
And this is one that I think will probably tweak the way that we ask this question, because lots of times what we try to do is if there was some kind of big problem that prevented you from getting all the way to the end of the trial, we try to save people time by saying, yes, I had a crop failure. But what we have found from, your comments back is that was actually not a perfect way to ask that question, because sometimes you would like to say, yes, I had problems, but also I still did get to the end of the trial. And so that's one that we'll work on how we ask that.
Right. And after we get through all the results too, I think when we get to the discussion section, if we could have some time to talk specifically about the survey, and if you have any ideas for improvements in the way those questions are asked, then we can have a conversation about that. But now Natalie is going to talk to you about some of the results we saw last year or this year.
Yeah, I keep saying last year too, because I'm thinking about 2024. But
right, me too. I'm already in the future right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to start with beans. And this was actually, I'll just say, probably one of the favorite bush or snap bean trials that we have done. We have kind of an old-fashioned French heirloom that is the dragon tongue. That's just a really unique type of bean. And then this one at the top was, you guys may not have noticed, but this was actually one that I really wanted to trial in 2022. And there was like a seed shortage. And so it took a while. They were all back ordered. So it took me to 2023 before we could get these seeds in. But it's one that I was really interested to see how people liked, because it is essentially more of a Kentucky Wonder type of a bean, but on a compact, or a bush plant. And so we did, we got high marks out of it, but you can see not a strong statistical difference, but 92% of people would recommend it. And we got good marks for yield and flavor out of that Magnum. So that was one that we really got very good results across the board on that bean trial. In the wax bean trial, we saw a little bit more disparate results. So you can see we actually did have a statistical difference in the rating. And so this is Capitano at the top, and you can see kind of a pale coloration and more of a flat bean, and then Goldilocks at the bottom, which was a more standard wax bean. And you can see it got high marks for health and for productivity. And I think that a lot of times what people liked was a very traditional wax bean type of shape. We actually had a couple notes on the Capitano that was like, I'm not really sure what's going on. This is different than any wax bean that I've ever seen before. So a fun trial, and actually some kind of clear results on that one. This is Rattlesnake, one of our favorites from a couple of years ago. And Rattlesnake is actually going to be our cover model for the 2024 home garden calendar. So always some fun stuff there. So in our pole bean trial, we had a very traditional along with kind of a newer cultivar. So Blue Lake, one of Blue Lake pole. Of course, we also have in the past trial Blue Lake bush beans. Once again, above 8, and 100% of people would recommend it. But really held their own with 90% and a 7.5. So once again, when we look at Blue Lake type bean, we just saw very good notes for taste, for versatility as far as canning, or even letting them get a little bit larger shelling or things like that. So just high marks across the board for that well-known but good performing bean. I didn't have a great picture of our okra this year, so I will say in transparency, I believe that's actually John Belaya for a couple of years ago. So if anybody has a really good cowhorn or velvet shot, you can send it to me for our trial report. But once again, good marks across the board. And this was one that we really had some great comments from our trialers. And one of my favorites this year was a note that said, I was watching these and I thought, you know what? I think that those pods would really take about another day. And came back tomorrow, and it turned out all they needed was another hour, right? So things like how well did they stay tender? Sort of like the picking intervals in the garden. Those are really useful comments for us, because when we think about the differences between some of our newer hybrids and some of these kind of older open pollinated or heirloom cultivars, that picking speed and how well does it stay tender in the field are some of the biggest things that we can we can share with gardeners. Because what I would say, and I can say this myself as more of kind of mid-Atlantic type of background in gardening, I hadn't really grown okra. So for a new okra grower, the speed of picking is one of the most important things that we can help them do for success. Then our slicer cucumber, and this is probably one of the stronger across the board yields and data return for our slicer cucumber trial. So we had General, which is one that we have trialed in the past. It's always done well in our trials, and you can see, this has probably only happened one time in the past. I think maybe on a yellow squash trial about 3 or 4 years ago, when we had 100% of our trialers recommend both of them. I think that was like the Tempest and Grand Prize year or something. But anyway, it's a very rare occurrence when we really get two that both perform quite well. And these were both selected for really strong disease resistance. So some of the viruses scab, powdery mildew. The DM stands for downy mildew, which is always one of the most damaging diseases that I see in my trials. It's kind of a late season, July into August type of disease, but we don't really have really effective sprays for that in the home type of garden. Commercial operations have stronger but more expensive chemicals that they can use for that. So resistance is really important for us when it comes to downy mildew. And this was a fun trial because we had kind of a standard hybrid as well as an open pollinated cultivar. That's what the OPs mean. That held up pretty well, and so both of them had very good marks for health and productivity. In my trials in Knoxville, the general did have probably a little bit higher yield, but poinsettia pretty much held its own. In the pickling cucumber trial, it was a similar type of trial in the fact that we kind of had an older open pollinated cultivar and a newer hybrid that had a wider disease resistance package. And so you can see on the ratings, they were not too far apart. The recommendations a little bit more. Those weren't statistically significant, but the significant things that we did see were marks for yield and flavor in Max Pack. And I'll tell you the experience that I had when growing these in my trial in Knoxville was that the double yields got ripe to overripe fast on me. And especially as the season wore on and it got hotter, my large yellow double yield cucumbers became much more prevalent. So, that's one of the differences sometimes, but that we're really breeding for kind of field stability, so to speak, in some of those newer hybrids. Now, you want to talk about a pretty dramatic result. This was probably one of the lowest performing cucumbers that we've ever trialed. And once we get to the end, I'll be curious to see if anybody did better than I did. But this is literally a picture from my trials this year. So this is the Dragon Suyu up here at the top. And this is the Armenian down here. And these are listed to be like long 3 or 4 foot fruit. And they just did not do it for me. It was a lot of leaf diseases in the plots. Like powdery mildew really hit these hard. And so it slowed down the plants and really decreased their productivity. So these specialty cucumbers wasn't a great year this year in our trial. But I do just want to say that we've had some years where this kind of long or burpless type of cucumber has done really well. These are tasty greens that are in the background right there. So we've had some very good trial years for some of those Asian type or burpless cucumbers, and we'll grow those again, but we probably won't grow Armenian and Dragon Suyu again. So this was kind of our container tomato trial. For the first several years of our trial, we hadn't done a lot of tomatoes because mailing out seeds and then, needing to go transplants always adds in an area of variability. But tomatoes are so important and container production is becoming so much more common, container or raised bed. Obviously, anything that grows well in a container is going to do well in a raised bed. And so we decided to do a determinate paste tomato trial this year. Little Napoli is actually a cultivar that I'd grown in years past. And then Nova is a slightly larger but still determinate cultivar. And so you can see, the returns were pretty good. Not statistically significant, but most people got pretty good disease, resistance and productivity out of both of these. And the interesting thing that we had is folks were growing these in different types of systems. So many of you were actually had a few plants in a container and had a few plants in raised beds. So we even kind of got some internal growing system comparisons. One of the great comments that we got back on that was along the lines of, I had these both in a raised bed and in a container right beside each other, and I got slightly higher yields in my raised bed, but I had lower disease impact in my containers and was able to harvest those for a little bit longer. So, those are just the really practical and very useful types of great feedback that we get from y'all. I just threw this in here. I don't know if we've got any Cumberland County people on the call this morning, but Little Napoli was one of the funniest cultivars that I grew, and one of our first in county tomato trials. So this is like 2016 and in Crossville, and we just put in a bunch of the trials that I was doing in Knoxville, but we mixed together our determinants and our indeterminants, and we got a big kick out of the Little Napoli because they were these tiny little determinant plants, and then they just be beside some, great big indeterminate plant. We do a better job of blocking, and not mixing our determinants and indeterminates. But I just remember, of course, the volunteers and Greg and folks that were helping with the trial didn't really know what to expect out of these. And Greg kept telling me through the summer, like, those little guys are productive, but they're just so tiny. So the opportunity to have you all trial things that I've grown in the past is just really fun, and gives us a chance to get much wider input on those. This was pretty much fighting to a draw for our specialty zucchini. So that's Mexicana on the left, and then Magda on the right. And I mean, almost exactly the same. Both had very good marks for health and size and appearance. I will say I may have actually seen slightly higher yield out of the Mexicana in my trials, but both of these held up pretty well, and I had a pretty good zucchini year. This is an interesting trial because this is Noche at the top, and that is a newer hybrid that has a little bit more viral disease resistance. So that's zucchini yellows and watermelon mosaic. We're starting to see more virus impact in our squash and our cucurbit types of plants, and so there's more disease resistance being bred in to those. So we have kind of a newer hybrid with more disease resistance, and then we have an older open pollinated cultivar. And in this instance, we just really saw across the board not a lot of differences. You can see a little bit more consistent fruit size and shape out of the Noche. The open pollinated black zucchini cultivar tended to get larger faster, so you had to stay on those. But really across the state, folks saw pretty similar results out of those. They weren't quite as high as what some of our top performing green zucchinis have been in the past. That's one of our favorites up there at the top, green tiger from a couple of years ago. But overall, a pretty good zucchini year. That's just one of my favorites, chiffon. Now, this was one of the funniest trials that we had this year. We've grown a lot of yellow squash over the years, and we have some volunteers, actually folks right here in Knoxville, who always grow one of these Tramontino types of squash, and I've heard about it for a long time, and I thought, you know what, like let's take their suggestions and do it in the trial this year. And so this is an interesting squash in the sense that yes, it will harden, the skin will harden, but if you pick it very young, it's really just kind of like a very large yellow squash or zucchini. And I try to not do any false advertising, but this was one that's growth pattern was much different than, its pairing super pick. And so we just got a lot of really funny comments from you all. One of my favorites was just like, heavens to Betsy, I had no idea how big this plant was going to get, which I actually experienced in my own trials. I just had Tromboncino vines all over the place. So very entertaining, but much different trial. You can see the statistical difference wasn't necessarily there, but maybe slightly higher recommendation rate for the super pick, a pretty standard hybrid, but pretty good, and marks across the board. Not quite what we've seen out of our favorite. This is what I referenced before our cucumber this year. I think this was the only trial from 3 or 4 years ago where we had 100% of people recommend both of them. So the bar is high for yellow squash. We've really had some very good yellow squash trials over the years. But one that didn't do so well this year was our muskmelon trial. As a more space consumptive crop, we don't typically have quite as high participation numbers on this one, and we had several folks who tried and just didn't get great crop performance this year. I was one of them. as you can tell, the fact that I'm still crediting the seed catalog with these pictures, which means that I didn't get good images from my own trial plots. So Delicious 51 is a newer disease-resistant cultivar, and Sarah's Choice is actually a cultivar, I believe it's bred by Johnny's themselves. And so you can see it did have a little bit better germination, but overall, it's just, I mean, you know, sixes is not, it's not really a very high trial number for us, and we didn't have that many people that completed the report. So I always like to show you my favorite melon picture. This is me with my culinary expertise right there. And that's Sugar Cube, which we've trialed a couple of times, and it's always been one of our favorites, as has the kind of traditional ambrosia muskmelon. So we'll mark 2023 as not a great melon year, and keep plugging away. Pumpkins are one. I don't know. Virginia and I were just talking about this. Like, I love, you know, a good pumpkin, but they're a challenging crop and really space consumptive. And so once again, you know, we didn't have a huge number of folks, and kind of got in the middle of the road results on those. So, you know, we'll see if that's, we try to throw in a pumpkin every couple 3 years, but they're kind of like sweet corn. We just have a hard time getting very good results. But we get great results out of basil. And so for the herbs this year, I actually grew like March, April runs of these herbs in the hydroponic system. I've got a hydroponic system in a greenhouse that's right over here beside the office. That's a little bit of iron deficiency there. But this, I think, is a really good picture to show what I know you all saw, which is this is Prospera on the left, and this is Winter on the right. So these had a very different plant habit, which we saw coming through in the comments. Large plant, but good taste. Smaller plant, good flavor. Some people got a little bit longer longevity, maybe a little bit slower to bloom out of the winter, but overall, you know, very good ratings out of both of these. Prospera has some downy mildew resistance, and so just really a very, very good trial. And this is really good information for us to be able to kind of communicate well for a container or for a raised bed. Really good comparison of those two. So this is the first time that we'd ever grown cilantro, and I had fun with the cilantro. As you can see, these were some early spring. Of course, confetti there on the left, kind of a fern leaf or a fine leaf, and this is Calypso, very traditional leaf type of cilantro. And what I saw in my trials was what we heard from the majority of you all, which is that the Calypso ended up most often being a slightly larger plant, kind of a more yield, and some folks also saw that it was a little bit slower to bolt. So, and a little bit stronger germination. So actually a difference between the rating on those two, with Calypso coming out ahead, and 100% of people recommending them. So this was fun because we had a lot of folks that were growing these in containers, and with a container cilantro, you can kind of, you know, as the spring turns into the early part of summer, you can kind of move that, try to keep it a little bit cooler. And we had a couple people who actually, I know when I went to summer celebration this summer, I had one of our West Tennessee trialers come up to me and say, "It's amazing, I still have cilantro that hasn't bolted yet, and it's the first time that's ever happened." So we had some folks who had really good success out of the cilantro this year. So with the we're now moving into flowers. You know that for a while we just had vegetables, but Virginia has changed it so that we have flowers, which is always our highest participation item. We always go through all of our flower seed the fastest. And this year we did Tithonia, or Mexican sunflowers. And this was kind of a fun trial for, you know, me from a horticulturist geeky position, because we kind of have the straight species, the taller traditional Mexican sunflower. And then we have a newer, actually, I believe Fiesta del Sol is an All American Selections winner, but a much more compact cultivar with more, it was a lot more expensive seed, right? So, you know, we just had kind of the selection impact that we were looking at there. And this is one of our really interesting results in that most people actually had better success with the much larger straight species cultivar. I know that way into September and October and my trial plots, the Tithonia is still just really blooming and doing great. So good marks for germination, for earliness of flowering, for number of flowering, and very high recommendation and rating for kind of our traditional old-fashioned or straight species Mexican sunflower. So we got fine results out of our calendula. This was one that, as a little bit or earlier season, we had some folks that this got in a little bit too late and things like that. But overall, pretty good ratings out of these, and they grow. This was a much easier to do in a container type of trial, so it really has been fun to implement some of these flowers into our trial. And then we also had 2 cool season crops. For the first few years that we did the trial, we didn't do very many cool season crops because, well, to be completely honest, it was about all we could do to get all of the envelopes packed and shipped out so that y'all could plant your warm season crops. But we've kind of been able to get our earliness up in this system, and so we had lettuce this year. These were both red leaf lettuce. As you can tell, these are some of my early spring crops from my hydroponic greenhouse trials. But this was a red kind of bib type. And then Cherokee is a summer crisp. And so this was an interesting comparison with, very similar size and days to harvest and all those types of things. Similar leaf coloration. We'd actually had very specific requests for red leaf lettuce. And what we found was that, for several of you, it really was true that that summer crisp held a little bit longer into the late summer, or maybe, late spring, or maybe even the early part of summer with very high ratings, 100%. So it was really a pretty successful trial, and nice to have kind of some quick turn crops that folks could grow in the spring or in the fall. And then the second cool season crops that we had was a snap pea. And so Snack Hero is a newer cultivar, actually, I believe an All-American, well, a newer cultivar anyway. I'm not sure if it's an AAS winner, but very compact. So it's a snap pea that you don't need any support for. Very container appropriate. But what we actually found, statistically significantly different, was that kind of a more traditional, larger sugar snap performed better for most of our trialers. Better germination, appearance, and just that larger plant gave them more production. And most people were willing to spend a little bit of extra time with some trellis and go ahead and do that for their trial. This isn't our home garden variety trial, but I just threw them in there so that y'all would know some of what I was doing in the plots this year. This is the first time that I'd ever done 2 kind of parallel determinate tomato trials. I did a May to July, and then I did a June to September trial, the same cultivars, just one couple rows over. And what I found was really similar yield trends, right? Similar yield trends. I always say that my goal for trialing tomatoes is to try to find anything that can beat a celebrity. And after, 7 years or something, I still haven't really found anything that can consistently beat a celebrity. But for the home gardener, there's some really interesting options out there. This middle picture right here, I know, determinate tomatoes, not terribly exciting images, but this is Tasty Lee, and it is a cultivar that's bred for good taste, but also high lycopene content. You'll actually see it as a branded product on the store shelves, and it held its own in those trials. And we had a really pretty yellow one that's VHN 871. So lots of times what I'm kind of doing is looking at some of these determinate tomatoes and then thinking about, well, how might that fit in some of our future trials. So as I come to the end here, I'll just give a plug. We have the online version of the home garden calendar has been released, and also today or tomorrow, the pallets should be arriving in Knoxville for all the printed versions. So within the next week or two, these will get out to counties. So, and what I want to say to all of you is kind of thanks for all of your help with our home garden variety trial, because this year especially, there's a lot of top 10 lists that are really kind of lay summaries of some of the great results that we've seen from our home garden variety trials. And so you have actually helped us write this calendar over the past few years. And this is just kind of an invitation ahead of time to join in for with us next year as we kind of pick some new stuff. And this is me in the month of May on tomato and pepper steak driving day. So always some good fun in the field there. And for this is the last slide, which will kind of take us to our discussion is some of the ideas that I was thinking about for next year, and that certainly will adjust and do some of the things that y'all think would be the most useful